November 14, 1944. The Moselle River Valley, northeastern France. A 19-year-old boy from Memphis lay in the freezing mud with a bandage wrapped around his leg and both hands raised where the enemy could see them. He was out of the fight. He was helpless. And then a German captain gave an order, and the rifles opened up again, and Private Dennis Ware was shot twice more where he lay. He never got up. He died 40 meters from cover in a fog so thick it swallowed the sound of the guns that killed him. What one American general did about it did not involve a bullet. It involved a single sheet of paper, and that piece of paper would follow the killer through every year of his life, inescapable until the day a court finally read it aloud. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more untold stories, forgotten events, and the moments of history that still deserve to be remembered. The man who chose the paper over the bullet was General George S. Patton. And the weapon he built was not made of steel. It was made of names, statements, and evidence. Before it was over, that weapon would put a war criminal behind bars for 12 years, preserve a dead teenager's name for eternity, and prove that revenge does not always come from the barrel of a gun. This is how one file destroyed a man who thought the fog would hide him forever. To understand what happened at that riverbank, you have to understand what November 1944 actually looked like for the men of the American Third Army. It was a season of mud exhaustion and slow grinding death. Patton's forces had raced across France in the summer, covering ground so fast the newspapers back home could barely keep up. But by autumn, the momentum had drained away. The rain came and would not stop. Fuel ran short. The roads turned to soup. And the Germans pushed back toward their own border, stopped running, and started fighting for every hedgerow, every village, every yard of ground. The Moselle sector became a meat grinder. Casualty numbers climbed into the thousands. Villages with names most Americans could not pronounce, Metz, Thionville, Curling-les-Cirques, changed hands in brutal close-quarters combat. Small patrols went out into the fog and did not always come back. Wounded men sometimes lay in no man's land for hours before anyone could reach them. Everyone knew the risks of a bullet, a shell, a mine. Those were the rules of the game, terrible but understood. But there was one line that even exhausted, desperate soldiers were supposed to respect. You did not shoot a man who was already down and disarmed. The Geneva Convention was clear. A wounded soldier, hands visible, no weapon, was no longer a combatant. He was a prisoner in waiting, a human being under the protection of the laws of war. Both sides broke that rule at times in the heat and terror of battle. But there is a difference between a panicked reaction and a cold, deliberate order. And what happened at Curling was not panic. The American command had seen atrocities before. They had learned to catalog them, to note them in reports, and move on, because the war did not stop for grief. Most incidents like this vanished into the paperwork. There was no time, no manpower, no mechanism to chase down a single enemy officer across a shifting front line for the killing of one private among thousands who died every week. The machinery of war simply did not work that way. A private was a private. There were hundreds of thousands of them, and they were dying at a rate that numbed the men whose job it was to count. To pull resources away from the fighting to hunt one enemy officer over one dead teenager would have struck most commanders as a waste. Justice, if it came at all, was supposed to wait for the end, if there was ever time for it at all. But everything was about to change because of one report that landed on the desk of a man who refused to let it wait. On the morning of November 14th, a 6-man patrol from the 5th Infantry Division was pulling back from a skirmish near Curling-les-Cirques. 2 of them were wounded. One of those men was Private Thomas Kellner, 21 years old, from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He was not a hero from the recruiting posters. He was an ordinary young man from a coal country town, the kind of soldier who made up the vast anonymous body of the American Army. On that day, Kellner was dragging a wounded corporal named Ray Foss through the muck when the shooting started again. Kellner threw himself flat, and in that moment, lying in the mud with his heart hammering, he heard something that did not make sense. The firing was not sweeping across the retreating patrol. It was concentrated, deliberate, aimed low at the ground where the wounded men lay. He heard Private Dennis Ware cry out once 30 feet away. Then he heard nothing at all. Ware was 19. He was from Memphis, Tennessee. He had been in Europe for exactly 11 weeks. When the fog shifted 20 minutes later and reinforcements pushed forward, they found Ware dead. He had been hit once, gone down, raised his hands, and then been shot twice more methodically where he lay. Foss had taken a fresh wound in the shoulder and barely survived. Any experienced soldier who examined the scene understood immediately what the angles meant. This was not a stray burst in the confusion. The shots had come from a fixed position, carefully aimed at men who were already finished. Someone had chosen this. Someone had ordered it. Thomas Kellner survived the war as a footnote, one witness among millions. But it was his account and the physical evidence around Ware's body that started everything. The report moved up the chain with unusual speed. By that evening, it was at regimental headquarters. By the next morning, it was at Corps. And by noon on the third day, it was lying on the desk of the commander of the entire Third Army. George Patton read the report once. Then he set it down and read it again slowly from the beginning. His aide, Captain Chester Hansen, was standing a few feet away and watched the whole thing. Patton did not explode. He did not slam the desk or shout the way the movies would have you believe. He just sat there, jaw locked tight, staring at the pages in front of him. The silence stretched out until it became unbearable. Then, without raising his voice at all, Patton said 5 words that would set everything in motion. Find out who gave that order. Now here is where the story turns, because what Patton decided to do next was, by the standards of 1944, almost insane. Chasing a single German captain across an active battlefront to answer for the death of one private was not how the war worked. There was no system for it. War crimes tribunals were still just an idea being argued about in conference rooms in London and Washington. Nobody knew if they would ever actually happen. Most commanders, buried under the weight of an entire army at war, would have filed the report and moved on. That was the sane, practical thing to do. Patton did the opposite. And to understand why, you have to understand the man. For all his reputation as a profane, pistol-wearing warrior who worshipped combat, Patton carried a rigid, almost old-fashioned code inside him. He believed the profession of arms was exactly that, a profession with honor at its center. To him, an officer's rank was not a license. It was a burden of responsibility. And the idea that a man wearing a captain's insignia had used his authority not to protect the helpless, but to murder them, offended something fundamental in him. It was not just a crime. To Patton, it was a betrayal of everything the uniform was supposed to stand for, a corruption of command itself. An officer who would order the murder of a wounded, surrendering boy was in Patton's eyes a disgrace to every soldier who had ever worn a rank honorably. So Patton made a decision that his own staff found strange. He was going to treat the death of Private Dennis Ware as if it were the most important case in his army. He wanted the officer responsible identified, hunted, captured alive, and held accountable, no matter how long it took or how the front lines moved. He wanted a paper trail so complete that no future confusion, no clever lawyer, no passage of years could ever make it disappear. In the middle of the largest war in human history, one general decided that one dead teenager would not be forgotten. The problem was almost laughable in its difficulty. The man they were hunting was still on the wrong side of the line, somewhere inside a collapsing but still dangerous German front, one officer among tens of thousands. And Patton had an entire army to command. The German unit responsible was quickly identified as the 19th Volksgrenadier Division. They had been fighting in the Moselle sector for weeks, bleeding men running low on everything. Their morale was cracking under the relentless pressure of the American advance. The officer who commanded the position at Curling was a Hauptmann, a captain named Ernst Vogler. He was 38 years old, a career Wehrmacht officer who had fought on the brutal Eastern Front before being transferred west. This was the crucial point. Vogler was not a frightened teenage conscript who panicked. He was a professional. He knew the Geneva Convention. He knew exactly what the laws of war demanded. And according to his own men, he gave the order anyway. One of Vogler's own sergeants, a man named Brandt, would later tell interrogators that he had hesitated when the order came. Shooting a wounded man with his hands up was not something he wanted to do, so Vogler repeated the order. And the sergeant obeyed. That single detail, one soldier's hesitation and an officer's cold insistence, would become the heart of everything that followed. Patton handed the hunt to his intelligence section, the famous G2, led by his trusted chief of intelligence, Colonel Oscar Koch. Koch was one of the best intelligence officers of the entire war, the man who had warned Patton about the coming German offensive in the Ardennes before almost anyone else believed it. Now he turned some of that formidable machine toward a single name. They knew Vogler's unit. They knew his rank. They knew his approximate position. What they needed was to get him across the line alive. So Koch and Patton built their trap out of pure patience. Every prisoner intake point in the entire 3rd Army sector was ordered to watch for one name. Ernst Vogler, Hauptmann, 19th Volksgrenadier Division. If he surrendered, he was to be pulled aside, instantly separated from the other prisoners, and held for direct interrogation. It was the intelligence equivalent of casting a net across the whole front and waiting for one specific fish to swim into it. It required something armies at war almost never have: patience. Vogler might surrender tomorrow. He might surrender in 6 months. He might never surrender at all. But Patton was willing to wait as long as it took because he had built the one thing that does not expire, does not retreat, and does not surrender: a permanent record. Then Patton did the thing that truly separated this case from every other. He sat down and personally drafted a memo to the Judge Advocate General's office, the Army's legal branch. In it, he laid out exactly what had happened at Curling. He named Private Dennis Ware. He described the circumstances of the shooting in careful detail, and he formally requested that a war crimes investigation be opened and that all the evidence be preserved for a future tribunal that at that moment did not yet even exist. This was December 1944. Patton was thinking years into the future while most of the world was just trying to survive the next week. When Captain Hansen delivered that memo to the legal office, the colonel there looked up and remarked that the general seemed serious about this one. Hansen told him the general was serious about all of them, but yes, especially this one. And so the trap was set: a name on a list, a memo in a file, a dead boy's identity written down and protected. Now all Patton could do was keep fighting the war and wait and hope that Ernst Vogler would one day walk out of the fog and straight into the net. He would not have to wait as long as he feared. But between that memo and that reckoning stood the single most chaotic month of the entire war on the Western Front. Because on December 16, 1944, the German army did something no one at Allied headquarters thought they still had the strength to do. In the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, they launched a massive, desperate surprise offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The entire Western Front erupted into crisis. Whole American divisions were shattered. And Patton was about to perform the most famous maneuver of his career, wheeling his entire army 90 degrees in the dead of winter to smash into the German flank and rescue the surrounded town of Bastogne. In the chaos of those weeks, a single flagged name on a prisoner list could have vanished forever. Vogler could have died in the fighting, or slipped away into the ruins of Germany, or been swallowed by the millions of men moving across a continent on fire. Everything Patton had set in motion now hung by a thread. One name on one list against the largest battle the American army had ever fought. It would have been so easy for Ernst Vogler to simply disappear into the chaos the way thousands of guilty men vanished at the end of the war and were never seen again. But in Part 2, we will see how a routine surrender at a muddy processing point months later brings Ernst Vogler face to face with the one American who never forgot his name. We will stand in that cold interrogation room as Patton lays a folder on the table and speaks the words that will haunt a war criminal for the rest of his life. And we will discover the shattering final sentence Patton delivers, the one about the fog that proves he knew the truth all along. And the hunt is only just beginning. When we left off, a single sheet of paper had become the most dangerous weapon in the Third Army. General George Patton had refused to let the murder of Private Dennis Ware disappear into the paperwork of a war that killed thousands every week. He had flagged the name of Captain Ernst Vogler at every prisoner intake point on his front, and he had drafted a memo demanding a war crimes investigation for a tribunal that did not yet exist. Then the Battle of the Bulge exploded across the Ardennes, and everything hung by a thread. But here is the part nobody tells you. The hardest enemy Patton faced in the Vogler case was not the German army. It was his own side. It was the system. And in the winter of 1944, that system had 100 reasons to bury the file and exactly 0 reasons to dig it back up. Consider the numbers. In the 6 weeks of the Bulge alone, the American Army suffered more than 80,000 casualties, 19,000 men killed. In that ocean of death, one private in the mud of curling was a statistical rounding error. And this is where things got worse. The obstacle had a shape, and the shape was procedure. When Patton's war crimes memo reached the legal machinery of the theater, it landed in front of men whose entire job was caution. The Judge Advocate General's branch was staffed with lawyers in uniform, and lawyers in uniform are trained to ask one question above all others. Can this actually be done? And in December of 1944, the honest answer to prosecuting an enemy officer for battlefield murder in the middle of an ongoing war was almost certainly no. There was no court. That was the first problem, and it was enormous. The great war crimes tribunals that history would later remember, the ones at Nuremberg, did not exist yet. They were arguments in conference rooms in London and Washington, contested by governments that could not agree on whether such trials were even legal. There was no established procedure, no precedent, no venue, no authority to hand down a sentence. Patton was demanding that evidence be preserved for a machine that had not been built. Then there was the practical objection, and it was brutal in its logic. Every hour an intelligence officer spent building a case against Vogler was an hour not spent on the living war. There were bridges to be crossed, cities to be taken, a German army to be destroyed. A staff officer at the theater level reportedly summarized the institutional view in a single cold sentence: "We are trying to win a war, not litigate one." To the men who thought that way, Patton's obsession looked like a general letting his temper override his judgment. And there was a quieter objection, one that nobody wanted to say out loud. If the American Army started formally documenting the murder of surrendering men, that door swung both ways. War is filthy. Wounded German prisoners had been shot by American soldiers too in the heat and terror of combat. Some in the legal branch worried that opening this line of inquiry could invite scrutiny they did not want. It was easier, cleaner, and safer to let the fog of war stay foggy. Every officer in that legal branch understood the unspoken arithmetic. A prosecution that succeeded would set a precedent. A precedent could be turned around and aimed at your own men. In a war this brutal, on a front this exhausted, almost nobody wanted to be the one to open that particular box. So the pushback came, and it came from above. Patton was not a man accustomed to being told no, but on this he was pressed hard by officers who outranked his authority in the legal sphere. The message delivered in the polite, bloodless language of staff work was this: drop it. Let the courts sort it out after the war, if there ever were courts. Focus on the front. There is a version of this story where Patton exhausted overextended fighting. The largest battle of his career simply lets the file slide into a drawer. Nobody would have blamed him. He did not let it slide. In a meeting with his own staff, according to accounts that survive, Patton made his position violently clear. He said that if the Army could find the manpower to court-martial a private for falling asleep on guard duty, it could damn well find the manpower to prosecute a captain for murdering a wounded boy. He said the uniform was not a shield for killers, and that an army which refused to police the difference between a soldier and a murderer was not an army worth commanding. And he made a decision that put his own reputation on the line. He would keep the case alive on his own authority inside his own army, whether the theater lawyers liked it or not. That was a risk. Patton had already nearly ended his career once over the infamous incident where he slapped a shell-shocked soldier. He knew what it meant to be one controversy away from being relieved of command. He chose to spend that credit here on a dead 19-year-old from Memphis. And then he found an ally he never expected from the very last place anyone would look. The ally wore a German uniform. His name was Brandt. He was a sergeant in the 19th Volksgrenadier Division, one of Vogler's own men. And in the last weeks of the war, he came walking across the line with his hands up like thousands of others. But Brandt carried something the others did not. He carried a conscience that had not stopped aching since the 14th of November, because Brandt had been there at Curling. Brandt had heard the order, and Brandt was one of the men who had pulled the trigger on Dennis Ware. When American interrogators processed him and matched his unit to the flagged case, something remarkable happened. Brandt did not hide. He did not lawyer up, deny, or claim he could not remember. He talked. He told them everything freely in detail, and what he said turned Patton's paper weapon from a memo into an indictment. Brandt described how the American patrol had begun withdrawing, how 2 wounded men were left exposed in the fog, how Vogler had directed his men to keep firing not at the retreating soldiers who could still fight, but at the ones already down on the ground. And then Brandt described the detail that would hang his captain. He said that when the order came, he had hesitated. Shooting a helpless wounded man with his hands visible was not something he wanted on his soul. And so Vogler had repeated the order, clearly, deliberately, a second time. There was no confusion in that. There was no fog in a man saying a thing twice. Brandt's testimony did something Patton could not have manufactured with all the authority of the Third Army. It proved intent. It proved that Curling was not a tragic accident of war, but a conscious choice made by a professional officer who knew exactly what the law required and chose to break it anyway. 2 other men from the unit gave corroborating accounts. The case was no longer one general's grudge, it was evidence. With Brandt's statement locked in, the plan changed. This was no longer about hoping a tribunal might someday exist. This was about building a record so airtight, so thoroughly witnessed and documented that it could survive anything. The chaos of the war ending. The passage of years. The clever defense of a man claiming he could not remember. Patton and his intelligence chief, Colonel Oscar Koch, understood they had one real shot at this. They had to get Vogler himself. Alive, in custody. On the American side of the line, where his rank meant nothing, and his file meant everything. The net was cast. The bait was patience. And in the first week of February 1945, the fish swam in. The day the test came was February 4th, 1945. At a prisoner processing point near Thionville, France, the war was doing what it does at the end. It was dissolving. The German front in the Moselle sector had collapsed entirely. Whole companies were surrendering at once, walking forward across the frozen ground with white flags and empty eyes, too exhausted to run anymore. Into this gray river of defeated men came a Wehrmacht captain with 7 soldiers. He was thin. His uniform was worn through at the elbows. He looked like every other broken officer surrendering that week, and if the system had worked the way it usually worked, he would have vanished into a prisoner cage, anonymous and unremarkable. But a processing sergeant checked his documents, and the sergeant's eyes moved down a list he had been ordered to watch. Ernst Vogler, Hauptmann, 19th Volksgrenadier Division. The name matched. The trap set 11 weeks earlier by a general 200 miles away closed with a quiet click. The sergeant separated Vogler from the others, immediately exactly as ordered, and held him apart. Within 2 hours, word was racing up the chain to 3rd Army headquarters. Patton was at dinner when they told him. According to Captain Hansen, who was there, Patton set down his fork. He wiped his mouth slowly, and then he said 7 words that ended the hunt and began the reckoning. "Tell them I will be there in the morning." He arrived at the processing camp outside Thionville at 9 in the morning. There was no ceremony, no entourage, no theater. Patton walked in wearing standard combat gear, 3 stars on his helmet, and went directly to the room where they were holding Vogler. This was the man who had built armies, wheeled 100,000 soldiers 90 degrees through a blizzard, and terrified the German high command. And he had come in person across a still active theater of war to sit across a wooden table from one captain. Vogler was seated when Patton entered. He stood and came to something resembling attention. A lieutenant named Marcus Field stood to the side as interpreter. For a long moment, Patton said nothing at all. He simply looked at the man. Then he spoke slowly in English and let Field translate each piece. "I know what happened at Curling," Patton said on the 14th of November. Vogler's face did not move. A 19-year-old American soldier named Dennis Ware was lying wounded on the ground with his hands visible. "You ordered your men to shoot him again. He died there." Still Vogler said nothing. "I want to hear you tell me why." The silence in that room must have been unbearable. Finally, Vogler spoke in German. He said the situation had been confused. He said he could not account for every round his men had fired. He said that in the fog his soldiers had been responding to perceived threats. It was the oldest defense in war. The chaos did it. The fog did it, not me. Patton listened to the whole translation. He nodded once slowly. Confused, he repeated, and then he laid a folder on the table. Inside were the witness statements, Brandt's account, the corroborating testimony, the reconstruction of exactly what had been said and done at Curling. Vogler's eyes dropped to the folder, and in that instant, he understood what it was. He understood that his own men had already been across this table. "Your own men told us what you said," Patton told him. Word for word. 4. He did not shout. He did not slam the table or lay a hand on the captain. He just stood there, and the weight of the thing pressed down on the whole room. "You wore the rank of an officer," Patton said. "You knew what that meant. And you chose to use it to kill a wounded boy lying in the mud." Then he turned to Field, the interpreter, and delivered the sentence that was the entire point of everything he had done since November. "Tell him this. He is going to be formally charged under the laws of war. This case has been documented, witnessed, and submitted. It will not disappear. It will follow him through every tribunal and every proceeding until someone with the authority to sentence him uses it." Field translated. Vogler sat very still, and Private Ware's name, Patton continued, is going into the record permanently, so that whoever reads this case in 5 years or 50 years knows exactly who he was and exactly what was done to him. Then Patton picked up the folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked to the door. And he stopped. He turned back one final time, and he said the thing that told Vogler the fog would never save him. The fog, Patton said. "There was no fog when your sergeant received the order. He told us that himself." And then he walked out. That was the moment the case stopped being a hope and became a certainty. Because the test had never really been about capturing Vogler. It had been about whether Patton's paper weapon would hold up when it finally faced the man it was built to destroy. It held. It held completely. It held. But winning the confrontation was one thing. Making it stick in the wreckage of a collapsing continent was another problem entirely, because now the case had to survive the end of the world. In the spring of 1945, Ernst Vogler was formally charged and transferred to Allied war crimes investigators. On paper, that sounds clean. In reality, the war was ending in a chaos almost impossible to describe. Germany was collapsing. Millions of prisoners flooded into Allied hands, so many that entire fields were turned into open-air cages. Concentration camps were being liberated, and the sheer scale of Nazi atrocity was pouring out into the light, thousands upon thousands of crimes, each one screaming for justice. In that avalanche, the danger was obvious. The murder of one private, however deliberate, could be swept away and forgotten one thin folder in a mountain of horror. This was exactly the fate Patton had built the file to prevent. The witness testimony of Sergeant Brandt and 2 other members of the unit became the core of the evidentiary record, and that record had been assembled with a care that most battlefield incidents never received. It was complete. It named names. It established intent. It had been created not as an afterthought, but as a deliberate act of preservation months before anyone else was thinking about post-war trials. When the machinery of justice finally did come into existence, and hundreds of cases were being processed in the immediate post-war period, the Vogler file was ready. It did not need to be reconstructed from faded memories. It already existed whole and waiting, and that changed the odds completely. A vague accusation months after the fact with witnesses scattered and dead is almost impossible to prosecute. A fully documented case with sworn testimony from the perpetrator's own men, preserved at the moment it happened, is something else entirely. It is a case that convicts. Investigators in 1946 and 1947 would find that the hardest part of prosecuting battlefield crimes was almost always the evidence itself. Memories faded. Witnesses died or vanished into displaced persons camps or simply refused to talk. Files like Vogler's assembled early and completely were rare and precious. They were the cases that actually ended in a verdict rather than a shrug. The difference between those two outcomes was the difference between one general shrugging and moving on, and one general sitting down to write a memo nobody asked him to write. There is a detail here that is easy to miss and impossible to forget once you see it. Patton never spoke about this case publicly. He never mentioned Vogler in his diary. He never wrote about it in his letters. The man who loved the spotlight, who gave speeches that became legend, said nothing about the one act of pure principle that cost him political capital and gained him nothing. He did not do it for credit, and he did not do it to be remembered. He did it because a 19-year-old was murdered on the ground, and someone with the power to remember decided that he would. But the story was far from over. Because a documented charge is not the same as a conviction. Between that frozen room in Thionville and any final verdict stood the collapse of Nazi Germany, the confused birth of an entirely new system of international justice, and the very real possibility that in the flood of thousands of cases, a single captain and a single dead private could still slip through the cracks. Vogler had heard Patton's promise. He had heard the words about the record and the tribunals. But promises made in the wreckage of war are not the same as sentences handed down by a court. And there was one more shadow falling over everything. The man who had built this weapon, who had guaranteed with 3 stars on his helmet that Dennis Ware's name would never be erased, was himself running out of time. Within months of the war's end, Patton's own story would take a turn that no one saw coming, one that would put the future of every case he cared about into question. In Part 3, we will follow the file out of the war and into the courtroom. We will see what happened when the machinery of justice finally caught up to Ernst Vogler in 1947, what sentence the record earned, and how close the whole thing came to falling apart. The confrontation was over. The trial was coming. And the real fight for Dennis Ware's name had only just begun. By now you know the shape of it. A wounded American boy named Dennis Ware, executed in the mud at Curling. A German captain named Ernst Vogler, who gave the order twice. And a general named George Patton, who refused to let it vanish, who built a weapon out of paper and patience and cornered the killer in a freezing room at Thionville. Patton had made a promise across that table. The record will not disappear. It will follow you until someone with the authority to sentence you uses it. That was February 1945. Vogler had heard the words. But words are not verdicts. And here is the brutal truth about what came next. The moment the war ended, the odds of that promise ever being kept began to collapse. Because the world that Patton threatened Vogler in did not survive the year. Within months, the alliance that won the war started to crack. The appetite for justice began to fade. And the one man who had guaranteed Dennis Ware would be remembered was about to run out of time in a way nobody saw coming. This was no longer a hunt. This was a race against forgetting. To understand the danger, you have to understand what the end of the war actually looked like for justice. On paper, it was a triumph. Germany surrendered in May 1945. The Great Trial at Nuremberg opened that November, and the world watched 21 of the most powerful Nazis in existence stand in the dock and answer for the deaths of millions. 12 of them were sentenced to hang. It looked like the machinery of accountability had finally arrived, vast and unstoppable. In the months that followed, the American Army alone would bring more than 1,000 defendants before its own military tribunals at Dachau, working through case after case of German officers, camp personnel, and reprisal killers. The numbers were staggering, and for a brief moment, the will behind them seemed limitless. But Nuremberg was the tip of an iceberg, and the iceberg was melting. Below those 21 famous names lay an ocean of smaller cases. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. Battlefield killings, camp guards, reprisal shootings. The American Army alone would run a long series of trials at a place called Dachau, processing case after case of ordinary atrocity committed by ordinary officers. And every single one of those cases faced the same three enemies: time, chaos, and the slow, grinding erosion of the will to prosecute. Each one on its own could kill a case. Together, they buried thousands. Time was the first enemy, and it was merciless. Witnesses scattered across a ruined continent. Soldiers went home. Prisoners were released. Memories that were sharp in 1945 turned soft and unreliable by 1947. A case that could not be proven fast was a case that quietly died. Investigators later estimated that the hardest evidence to hold on to was exactly the kind Curling depended on the sworn word of men who had been there and were willing to talk. Chaos was the second enemy. Occupied Germany in 1945 and 1946 was a landscape of rubble and displaced millions. Records burned. Files were lost by the truckload. Prosecutors were overwhelmed, understaffed, drowning in paperwork for crimes that ran from the theft of a chicken to the murder of a nation. In that flood, a single folder about a single dead private could slip beneath the surface and never come up again. Most of them did. And the third enemy was the coldest of all. It was politics. Almost as soon as the shooting stopped, a new conflict began to take its shape: the Cold War. The Soviet Union, yesterday's ally, was becoming tomorrow's threat, and a defeated occupied Germany was suddenly not a criminal to be punished, but a prize to be won, a future ally against the East. Slowly, quietly, the mood shifted. Prosecuting German officers began to feel less like justice and more like an inconvenience. In the years that followed, many war crimes sentences would be reviewed, reduced, and commuted. Men sentenced to death saw their sentences cut. Men sentenced to long prison terms walked free early. The window for accountability was closing, and everyone in the legal branch could feel it. Prosecutors who had arrived in 1945 burning to punish the guilty found themselves, by 1947, working against their own headquarters. Budgets shrank. Staff were pulled away to other duties. The instruction filtering down was rarely spoken outright, but it was understood. Wrap it up. Move on. Do not make more work than you have to. In that climate, a case had to be not just strong but self-sustaining, able to convict almost on its own, because nobody was going to spend extra effort to rescue it. This was the environment Vogler's case had to survive. Not a triumphant march of justice, but a narrowing corridor, with the walls closing in a little more every month. But this was not the only shadow falling over the file, because the man who built it was gone. On December 9, 1945, in occupied Germany, George Patton was riding in a staff car outside Mannheim when it collided with a truck at low speed. The other men in the vehicle walked away. Patton did not. The impact broke his neck and left him paralyzed from the shoulders down. For 12 days he lay in a hospital bed, the most aggressive commander of the war, reduced to a body that would not move. On December 21, 1945, he died. Think about what that meant for Curling. The entire weight behind the Vogler case had been personal. It was Patton's authority, Patton's obsession, Patton's 3 stars that had kept the file from being buried a dozen times over. He was the one who drafted the memo nobody asked for. He was the one who flagged the name across an entire army. He was the one who drove to Thionville to make the promise in person. And now, with the trial still more than a year away, that engine of will was simply gone. The general who swore Dennis Ware would be remembered would not live to see whether anyone kept the promise. For a moment, it looked like the whole thing might die with him. There was no shortage of ways for the case to quietly evaporate. A lost box, a reassigned prosecutor, a defense attorney who ran out the clock, a review board in a hurry. Vogler had every reason to believe that the man who threatened him was dead. The war was over, and the world had bigger horrors to prosecute than one shooting in the fog. He was almost right. And in the ordinary run of things, he would have been. Dead general closed war, 1,000 louder crimes screaming for attention. By every reasonable calculation, Curling should have slipped through the cracks like so many others did. But Patton had understood something the cynics had not. He had understood that a man dies, but a document does not. He had not built the case to depend on his own survival. He had built it to be independent of everyone, including himself. The witness statements were sworn and filed. Sergeant Brandt's confession was on the record, corroborated by 2 other men from the unit. The chain of evidence had been assembled early when memories were fresh and witnesses were in custody exactly as Patton designed. The file did not need Patton to be alive. It only needed someone to open it. And in 1947, someone finally did. The event that decided everything was not a battle. It was a trial. And in its own quiet way, it was the most important engagement of this entire story. The proceeding took place in occupied Germany in 1947 as part of the long series of war crimes cases the American military ran in those years. There were no headlines. Ernst Vogler was not a famous name. He was one captain among hundreds of defendants, processed in that period, a small case in a mountain of them. And that is exactly why it mattered. Because the small cases were the ones that usually vanished. This one did not, and the reason it did not was sitting on the prosecutor's table in a worn folder assembled by a dead general 2 years earlier. Picture the room, a military courtroom, a panel of officers as judges, a prosecutor, a defense counsel assigned to a man almost nobody was watching, and Ernst Vogler, older now, thinner, no longer a captain of anything, sitting where the accused sit. The war he had fought for was gone. The uniform he had disgraced meant nothing. He had spent 2 years imagining, perhaps hoping, that the promise made at Thionville had died in a hospital bed near Mannheim. Then the prosecution opened the file. And this is where you understand what Patton actually built. The case did not rest on the fading memory of a traumatized American witness. It did not rest on speculation about angles and bullet wounds. It rested on the testimony of Vogler's own men. Sergeant Brandt's account was the spine of it. Brandt had described clearly and under oath how the American patrol had begun to withdraw. How 2 wounded soldiers were left exposed on the ground. How Vogler ordered his men to keep firing, not at the retreating soldiers who could still fight, but at the helpless men already down. And how, when Brandt hesitated, Vogler repeated the order. A second time, deliberately. That single detail did to Vogler in the courtroom exactly what it had done in the folder. It destroyed the fog defense completely. A man cannot claim confusion when his own sergeant heard him give the order twice. 2 other members of the unit backed Brandt's account. The prosecution laid out the physical evidence gathered at the scene, the wound pattern that showed a man shot again after he was already down and disarmed. And they named the victim over and over, exactly as Patton had insisted. Private Dennis Ware, 19 years old, Memphis, Tennessee, 11 weeks in Europe, killed with his hands raised. The defense tried what defenses always try: the chaos of combat, the impossibility of accounting for every round, the heat of a collapsing front. They argued that a captain could not be responsible for every bullet his exhausted men fired in a fog so thick it swallowed sound. They suggested the American witnesses were mistaken, that the angles were misread, that grief had turned a tragedy into a crime. For a moment in a courtroom, 2 years and a lifetime removed from that riverbank, the fog defense might even have worked. But you cannot argue chaos against a documented, corroborated, twice-repeated order. Every objection broke against the same wall. The record. The record. The record. It had been built in the winter of 1944 precisely so that it could not be argued away in the winter of 1947, and it could not. But every time the defense reached for confusion, the prosecution reached back into the folder and produced clarity. A sworn statement, a corroborating voice, a repeated order. The panel deliberated, and then they returned. The panel convicted Ernst Vogler. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. 12 years. Read that number the way it deserves to be read. In an era when the will to punish was fading, when many sentences were being quietly reduced, and many killers were walking free early, a small obscure case about one dead private held. It held because it had been built to hold. It held because a general nobody could argue with had sat down in the middle of a war and refused to let one boy be forgotten. Vogler had told Patton the situation was confused. The court reading Patton's file 2 years later found nothing confused about it at all. The fog that Vogler hid behind at Curling could not survive contact with the record. And here is the part that turns a courtroom verdict into something larger. The conviction was not the end of what Patton preserved. The name was, because tucked inside that permanent record was the thing Patton had cared about most, more than the sentence, more than the punishment. Private Dennis Ware of Memphis, Tennessee, was awarded the Purple Heart posthumously. The citation stated that he was killed in action. His mother received it at their home in November 1945, 1 year after her son died in the mud outside Curling. A single medal in a small home, 1 year and one continent removed from the fog where he fell. She would never know the full story of the general who made sure her boy's name went into a file that would outlive them all. She would never know that a captain in an occupied country would answer for what happened to her son. But because of that file, Dennis Ware was not an anonymous casualty statistic. He was a documented human being with a name, a hometown, an age, and a death that someone was held accountable for. The reckoning rippled outward from that single case. Vogler's conviction was one of hundreds in the American war crimes program of those years, and cases like his cases built early and built completely were the ones that actually reached a verdict. The pattern was clear across the whole effort. Where the evidence had been preserved at the moment convictions followed. Where it had been left to fade, the guilty walked. The difference between justice and forgetting again and again came down to whether someone had bothered to write it down while it still could be written. Investigators of the period understood this in their bones. A case assembled in the first days with the perpetrator's own men still in custody and still willing to speak was worth 10 cases reconstructed from rumor a year later. Vogler's file was the rare one that had been done right the first time, and it convicted a man precisely because of that discipline. The men who were in that room at Thionville understood what they had witnessed better than anyone. One of them, the interpreter Lieutenant Marcus Field, gave an account to a military historian years later. He said something that cuts to the heart of the entire story. He said that Patton had not wanted revenge in the way people imagine it. He had not wanted to watch Vogler suffer. He had not wanted a bullet. What he had wanted was for the record to exist. He had wanted it to be impossible to pretend that Curling never happened. He had wanted Dennis Ware's name to mean something in the final accounting. That, Field said, was Patton's revenge. Not a bullet. A file. Permanent, documented, and inescapable. And the strangest, most telling detail of all is what Patton did afterward, which was nothing. He never spoke about the case in public. He never mentioned Vogler in his diaries. He never wrote about it in his letters home. The most famous, most self-promoting general of the war took the one act of pure, quiet principle in this story and told no one. He did not do it to be celebrated. He built the file, made the promise, and let the record speak for itself exactly as he had designed it to. There is no monument to Curling. There is no famous photograph. There is only the paper and the name and the quiet fact that a man was punished who might otherwise have gone free. That file still exists. It sits today in the National Archives decades after every man in this story has died. Anyone who opens it will read the name Dennis Ware and the age 19 and the town of Memphis and exactly what was done to him in the fog and exactly who answered for it. That was the whole point. Patton wanted it to be impossible in 5 years, or 50, or 100, to pretend it had not happened. He won. The proof is simple and undeniable. You are hearing this boy's name right now, more than 80 years after he died, because one man refused to let it be erased. So the crazy idea, the one the theater lawyers thought was a general letting his temper run away with him, worked. It did not win a battle. It did not shorten the war. It did something quieter, and in its own way more permanent. It proved that in the middle of the largest slaughter in human history, a single documented act of conscience could reach across years and continents and put a killer behind bars for a 19-year-old nobody important. A file beat the fog. A record beat forgetting. And a dead general kept a promise from beyond the grave exactly as he swore he would in that cold room at Thionville. But there is a final chapter here, and it is the one almost nobody knows. Because the story of Dennis Ware and Ernst Vogler is not really a story about one shooting in one fog on one November morning. It is a story about a question that outlived everyone involved. What do we owe the forgotten? What does it actually cost to make sure that the smallest life ended in the cruelest way is not simply erased by the scale of everything around it? Patton answered that question with a folder. But the answer echoes far beyond one captain and one court. In the final part, we will follow this idea out of the archives and into the present, and we will see why a single sheet of paper from November 1944 may be the most important thing George Patton ever did, more lasting than any battle he ever won. This story still has one chapter left, and it is the one that changes how you see all of it. Over 3 parts, you have watched a single idea travel from a muddy riverbank to a courtroom in occupied Germany. A wounded boy named Dennis Ware shot on the ground with his hands raised at curling. A German captain named Ernst Vogler who gave the order twice. A general named George Patton who refused to reach for a bullet and reached for a folder instead, who built a weapon out of sworn testimony and cold patience and made a promise across a table at Thionville. That promise was kept. In 1947, the record convicted Vogler, and Dennis Ware's name went permanently into history. The idea worked. The file beat the fog. But we ended part 3 with a question that has been waiting this whole time. What happened to the man behind it? And here is where the story turns one last time, because the answer is not what you expect. This final chapter has a twist that almost nobody knows a truth about what Patton actually left behind that is stranger and more lasting than any medal or any battle. Because sometimes the single most important thing a person ever does is the one thing they never once talk about. And sometimes success comes with a price that only becomes clear long after the man who paid it is gone. Let us begin with the fate of the general himself, because it is heavy with irony. George Patton spent his entire life chasing glory on the battlefield. He wanted to die, as he once said, with the last bullet of the last battle of the last war. He got none of that. He survived the fiercest fighting in Europe untouched, only to be broken by a low-speed car accident on a quiet road near Mannheim in December 1945. He died in a hospital bed, paralyzed, 12 days later at the age of 60. The most aggressive warrior America produced in that war did not fall in combat. He simply slipped away in the silence after the guns went quiet. There is a strange cruelty in that ending. A man who had commanded hundreds of thousands, who had outmaneuvered the finest generals Germany could field, who had begged the universe for a soldier's death, was undone by a bent fender on an ordinary afternoon. Whatever plans he had for the peace died with him. And so did his voice in the Vogler case, more than a year before the trial that would decide whether his promise meant anything at all. And here is the irony that makes the Vogler case so remarkable. The world remembers Patton for the loud things, the pearl-handled pistols, the speeches, the slap, the mad 90-degree pivot to relieve Bastogne. His name is a byword for aggression, for spectacle, for the theater of war. Yet the act in this story, arguably the most morally pure thing he ever did, was one he performed in near silence and never claimed. He did not mention curling in his diaries. He did not write about Vogler in his letters home. He built the file, made the promise, and walked away and let the record do the work long after he was in the ground. Think about what that restraint actually reveals. A man who craved recognition more than almost any commander of his era chose on this one occasion to want nothing for himself. There was no press conference at Thionville. There was no citation with Patton's name on it. The reward for keeping the promise was simply that the promise was kept whether or not anyone ever knew he was the one who kept it. Justice for Dennis Ware was the entire point, and Patton's own credit was not part of the equation. The others in the story faded quietly, as most people in history do. Ernst Vogler served his sentence and vanished into the post-war obscurity that swallowed thousands of convicted officers, a man defined forever by a single order given in a fog. Sergeant Brandt, the German, who could not live with what he had done and told the Americans everything disappeared back into a shattered country, his conscience, the reason a killer was convicted. Lieutenant Marcus Field, the young interpreter who stood in that room and heard every word, carried the memory for decades until he finally gave his account to a historian. And Dennis Ware's mother, who received a Purple Heart at her home in Memphis in November 1945, lived the rest of her life, almost certainly never knowing the full story of the general who made sure her son was not forgotten. Imagine her holding a medal and a folded citation that said "only killed in action," grieving a boy who had been gone from home for barely 3 months. She never got to read the file. She never got to hear Patton's words in that cold room. She only had the medal and the silence and the ordinary bottomless grief of a mother who outlived her child. And yet, without her ever knowing it, her son had become the center of something that would outlast them both by generations. But the real legacy of what Patton did at Curling does not live in any of their individual fates. It lives in something much larger and much more enduring than any single life. Because the principle behind that file, the idea that evidence of a battlefield crime must be preserved at the moment, documented, witnessed, and made permanent, did not die in 1947. It became one of the quiet foundations of how the modern world tries to hold war accountable. And that is the part of this story that reaches all the way to the present day. Consider what came after. In 1949, just 2 years after Vogler's conviction, the nations of the world gathered and rewrote the Geneva Conventions. They strengthened the protections for exactly the kind of man Dennis Ware had been in his final moments, the wounded soldier, the one who is out of the fight, the prisoner in the making. They created a category called grave breaches, serious violations of the laws of war for which individuals could be held personally responsible. The core idea Patton had acted on instinctively at Curling, that an officer is accountable for the order he gives and cannot hide behind the chaos of combat, was written into international law that still governs armed conflict today. Trace the thread forward, and it never breaks. The principle established at Nuremberg and reinforced in cases like Vogler's that following orders is no defense, and that documentation is the enemy of impunity, carried into every conflict that followed. It shaped how war crimes were investigated in Korea, where American forces documented atrocities against prisoners. It ran through the long, painful reckonings of the Vietnam era, where the investigation and prosecution of battlefield killings depended entirely on whether evidence had been preserved. It became the entire operating philosophy of the international tribunals of the 1990s, the courts assembled to prosecute the horrors of Yugoslavia and Rwanda, which convicted men for atrocities, precisely because investigators had done what Patton did, gathered the testimony, locked in the witnesses, and built records that could not be argued away. Where those records existed, commanders who had ordered the unthinkable were convicted years and sometimes decades after the fact. Where they did not, the guilty aged comfortably into old men who never answered for anything. The single variable again and again across half a century of trying was whether someone had done the unglamorous work of writing it down while it could still be written. And it lives on right now in the 21st century in the International Criminal Court, and in every war crimes investigation being conducted in conflicts happening as you read this. The methodology is the same one that Folder embodied in 1944. Find the witnesses while they can still speak. Preserve the testimony before memory fades. Build a record so complete that the passage of years and the fog of politics cannot erase it. Every modern investigator who photographs a mass grave, who takes a sworn statement from a survivor, who catalogs evidence for a court that may not sit for another decade, is doing exactly what Patton understood in that freezing room outside Thionville. The weapon against forgetting is documentation. Put a number on it if you want to feel the scale. The framework of accountability that Curling and thousands of cases like it helped establish has, across the decades since, brought hundreds of war criminals to justice and shaped the conduct of armies across more than 190 nations bound by the Geneva Conventions. But the deeper truth is that the number is unknowable because the real measure is not the men convicted. It is the crimes that never happened, the orders never given, because somewhere an officer remembered that the record survives and the fog does not protect you forever. Yet the largest lesson in this story is not about international law, and it is not about technique. It is about something far simpler and far harder. It is about what one person decides to do when the system tells them not to bother. Remember that every force in this story pushed toward forgetting. The war was vast, and the dead were numberless. The legal branch had 100 reasons to bury the file and no reason to keep it. The politics of the coming Cold War made prosecuting German officers an inconvenience. Time itself worked to erase the evidence. Every rational, practical institutional pressure said the same thing. Let it go. One private does not matter against all of this. And into that overwhelming current, one man planted himself and said, "This one matters, and I will not let it slide." That is the lesson that outlives the law. Institutions, by their nature, resist the inconvenient. They optimize for efficiency, for caution, for the path of least resistance. And the inconvenient truth is often the first thing they are willing to sacrifice. It takes an individual, someone with conviction, and the will to spend their own credibility to force a system to do the harder, better thing. Patton risked his reputation on a case that offered him nothing. History is full of moments like that, where progress or justice hinged not on the machinery, but on one stubborn person refusing to accept that nothing could be done. Think of the clerks and officers throughout the war who quietly preserved evidence of atrocities against orders whose hidden documents later put commanders in the dock. Think of the lone investigators who kept lists of the missing when everyone told them the missing were beyond counting. Think of the survivors who testified when it would have been so much easier to stay silent and forget. In every case, the pattern is identical. The system produces the crime, but an individual conscience produces the accountability. Patton belongs in that quiet company, and it may be the most honorable company he was ever part of. We tell ourselves that big changes come from big forces. But look closely at almost any turning point, and you find a person, not a process. You find the individual who documented the thing everyone wanted buried, who spoke up when silence was easier, who kept the receipt when everyone said to throw it away. The most powerful act in this entire 90-minute story was not a battle or a maneuver. It was a decision to write something down and make sure it survived. And that kind of courage, the quiet, unglamorous administrative courage of insisting the truth be recorded, is available to anyone in any era, including ours. It is the courage of the person who documents the thing their organization would rather forget, who keeps the email, who files the report nobody wants filed, who refuses to let an inconvenient truth dissolve into deniability. We live in an age drowning in information and starved for records that actually hold. Patton's lesson has never been more relevant. What is not written down can be denied. What is preserved, witnessed, and made permanent becomes impossible to erase. And there is one final detail. The thing that most people who hear this story never fully grasp, and it changes the meaning of everything. Here is the twist. The file was never really about Ernst Vogler at all. Punishing one captain was never the deepest purpose of what Patton built. 12 years in prison for one man was justice, yes, but it was almost incidental to the true design. Look again at what Patton said in that room at Thionville. He did not talk mainly about the sentence. He talked about the record. He said Dennis Ware's name was going into the file permanently, so that whoever read it in 5 years or 50 years would know exactly who he was and exactly what was done to him. That was the real weapon, not the conviction, the remembering. Because a sentence ends. Vogler served his 12 years, and the punishment was complete. But a name in a permanent record does not end. It waits. It sits in the National Archives to this very day, decades after every man in this story has died, and it does one thing, the one thing Patton actually wanted. It makes forgetting impossible. Patton did not build a weapon to destroy Ernst Vogler. He built a machine to preserve Dennis Ware forever against the erasing power of time and scale and indifference. The conviction of Vogler was the mechanism. The survival of the name was the mission. Understand that distinction, and the entire story rearranges itself in front of you. This was not at its heart a revenge story at all. It was a rescue. Patton reached into the anonymous mass of the dead and pulled one boy back out into the light, and he built the light strong enough to last 100 years. And now comes the part that should give you chills. That machine is still running, right now, in this moment, because the entire purpose of that file was to reach across the decades and force a stranger someday somewhere to speak the name of a 19-year-old from Memphis who died in the mud with his hands raised. You are that stranger. By hearing this story, you have become the final and most important part of the record Patton started in 1944. He wanted it to be impossible to pretend that Dennis Ware never existed, and 80 years later, in a way he could never have imagined, you are the proof that he succeeded. The file reached you. The promise held. A general who died in 1945 reached forward through 8 decades and made you a stranger he could never meet complete the sentence he started in the fog. That is not a metaphor. That is precisely mechanically what a permanent record is designed to do. It is a message sent to a future the sender will never see. And today, you received it. So let us gather the whole of it into a few final words. A wounded boy was murdered in the fog, and a general who could have looked away chose instead to build a permanent record that convicted the killer, kept the victim's name alive, and helped shape the very laws by which the world now judges the crimes of war. From one cold-blooded order given in the mist at Curling to a single folder that still sits today in the National Archives, this was never truly a story about revenge. It was from the very first shot in the fog, a story about memory itself as the ultimate lasting form of justice. Patton proved something that outlasts every battle he ever won. He proved that the loudest weapon in the world is not a rifle or a tank, but a record that refuses to be erased. He proved that you do not need a bullet to defeat a man who thought the fog would hide him, that a single sheet of paper made permanent and inescapable can reach further and last longer than any act of violence. And he proved that even in the largest slaughter in human history, one life, one name, one 19-year-old nobody thought was important could be made to matter for as long as the record survives. And in doing so, he answered the question this whole story was really asking. What do we owe the forgotten? We owe them the record. We owe them the refusal to let their names dissolve into a statistic. We owe them someone willing to write it down and make sure it lasts. Dennis Ware was in Europe for 11 weeks. He was killed in his first real taste of war on a foggy morning most of the world would never hear about in a village most people cannot pronounce. By every law of scale and statistics, he should have vanished without a trace, one anonymous name among 16 million American service members and tens of millions of dead. Instead, here you are, 8 decades later, knowing his name, his age, his hometown, and exactly what was done to him. That is not an accident. That is a promise kept by a dead general carried across a lifetime by a single sheet of paper. The fog came down hard that morning at Curling and swallowed the sound of the shots. But it could not swallow the record. And it could not swallow the name. 80 years later the fog is gone, and the name remains. Because in the end, the men with the guns write the history of the battle, but the man who keeps the file quietly and without applause writes the history that lasts. Dennis Ware is remembered. And now, in a way, a dead general planned and never lived to see you are part of the reason why.